When the Zombies 5 official trailer dropped, most eyes were drawn to the Sirens, these powerful new enemies arriving with a promise of chaos, destruction, and chaos, unlike anything we've seen before. But if you watch that trailer again with attention, not just excitement, something curious starts to emerge. The Sirens are positioned as the danger, the big threat, the next big villainous force. Yet their presence in the trailer doesn't feel disruptive. It doesn't feel loud. It feels almost expected, which raises the first unsettling question. What if the Sirens aren't the real danger? This season, the real threat isn't coming from the outside. It's coming from within the world that thought it was prepared. Threat reframed. Fear eats harmony, not monsters. The Sirens have all the hallmarks of a classic antagonist. They're mysterious, powerful, and visually striking. But the trailer doesn't treat them like a world-ending force. It treats them like catalysts, not final bosses. Why does that matter? Because in narratives like this, the external enemy is often a mirror for something already breaking inside the society we're watching. Instead of asking, how do we defeat the Sirens, the show seems to be asking, what happens when fear starts eroding unity long before the enemy lands? Look at the moments in the trailer that don't feature the Sirens, the characters reacting, talking, planning. What you notice isn't a group galvanized against a shared threat. It's a group already on edge, already divided, already questioning trust. That's the real danger. Not the unknown, not the invasion, but the fragility of unity. When fear becomes the enemy within. In every successful franchise that faces an external threat, whether alien, supernatural, or apocalyptic, there's always an internal conflict running parallel. In previous chapters of the zombie series, humanity survived because people worked together. They shared information. They believed in a common goal. But when fear spreads faster than information, when mistrust grows faster than understanding, that's when civilizational cracks begin to widen. And the trailer for Zombies 5 is full of subtle cues that fear is already winning the internal battle. Characters glance at each other with suspicion, not solidarity. There are pauses where one would expect confidence. There are moments where the camera lingers just a bit too long on uncertainty, and that is far more destabilizing than any monster, because monsters you can fight, fear you can't. What the Sirens represent versus what they reveal. The Sirens, in a traditional sense, would be a power that invades, attacks, overwhelms, but the way they're framed here suggests something different. They're a test of resilience, trust, internal coherence, shared narratives. The Sirens don't need to be the worst thing that ever happened. They just have to arrive at the moment people are already turning on one another. Stories don't fall apart because the enemy is powerful. They fall apart because the protagonists lose faith in themselves and in each other. And that seems to be the thread Zombies 5 is tugging at. Echoes of past mistakes in a new fear economy. There's another layer that elevates the real threat beyond the Sirens. In every iteration of the zombie series, humanity wasn't just fighting creatures, they were fighting context collapse, the loss of meaning, identity, and common ground. Zombies 5 opens in a world where people have seen too much death. No belief system feels infallible. Everyone's certainty has been tested repeatedly. When you take fear alone and strip it of meaning, when it becomes the dominant narrative instead of a reaction, what's left? A society that stops having reasons to unite. And a society that fractures from within is far easier to dismantle than one that fights external monsters. So, what are the Sirens really doing? This becomes the critical question. Are the Sirens the real danger? A distraction? A symptom? Or are they the smoke that rises only after the fire underneath has already begun? The trailer's tone doesn't sell fear as survival instinct, it sells fear as division, and that's the most dangerous thing you can introduce into any community. Not a monster, not an invasion, but the belief that cooperation is no longer safe. And that's why this season feels different. This isn't a story about surviving an assault. It's a story about what happens when people forget why they used to fight together. What happens when fear feels like protection? What happens when unity feels like denial? The sirens may arrive, they may roar, but the real danger, the one that actually changes everything, is how people respond to them, not what they do. That's why this trailer feels unnerving in a quiet way. That's why it lingers on hesitation. That's why it feels like unity is already cracking before the sirens even land. Because the real question isn't, can they defeat the sirens? The real question is, can they still trust each other once fear becomes the default currency? And that is the thread Zombies 5 might be pulling on, the unraveling of society from the inside, long before the siren song even begins.